ACH account validation isn't just a matter of compliance, it's an opportunity to explore new business models and give lenders and service providers smarter ways to say yes to the consumers who show up at their digital front doors. With me today is the man who coined the phrase smarter ways to say yes when ACH payments are presented, the CEO of ValidiFI, John Gordon. Hey, John, welcome.
How are you? Great to be here.
I'm great. Do you have if you don't have, you need t-shirts and hats. Smarter ways to say yes. I mean, that's a slogan.
It could be. I'm afraid it might get me in trouble in the general public. So you would know what I was talking about, but maybe others wouldn't be so sure.
I still think we all need smarter ways to say yes. So I do think
Fair
it
enough.
could be universal appeals. But when it comes to ACH account validation, let's get down to business. So when you and I chatted, you told me the following: ValidiFI is in the business of establishing a connection between a consumer and her bank. Fair. That ecosystem, very big, very complex, and very dynamic. So help us understand where you guys fit.
Absolutely. So at ValidiFI, we really are focused on that connection between a consumer and their bank account to establish the validity of the bank account in an effort to identify potential fraud, assess risk, and for the purpose of product placement or line assignment for loans, so that our clients are making better decisions when they onboard clients. And we're giving them the flexibility to do that in any way that the consumer chooses.
So any way the consumer chooses, by way of example, including what?
Credentialed. So if they want to log into their bank accounts, we can do that. But what we've found is the more friction you inject in the process as a financial service provider, the less likely you are to have success in onboarding clients. Mm-hmm. So the majority of our engagements are zero friction. You provide us the consumer's application data, as we term it: name, address, phone, email, and their bank account and routing number, and we give you intelligence back to help you make a smarter decision.
I want to dig a little deeper, and I want to reflect on something that you mentioned when we were chatting before we went live. And you said the following: so obviously NACHA rules require that ACH payment originators have commercially reasonable systems to do all the things that you just said, detect fraudulent transactions for ACH payments. But when you and I were chatting, you said that's really not good enough, at least from where you sit and from the perspective of your business. So why not?
Well, what we find is the current NACHA web debit rule says you have to confirm an account is open, valid, facilitates ACH. Mm-hmm. Commercially reasonable, as you have said. Going forward, the amended rule for 2026 removes commercially reasonable and puts procedures and processes language in there that ODFIs have to have in place to potentially detect fraud. Mm-hmm. What we have found is if you were just looking at an account and routing number and not looking at the marriage between that account and routing number and the consumer who's applying with it, you're missing an opportunity to better quantify that consumer on a number of different levels.
So that brings me to a framework that I want to test on you. So if you take the commercially reasonable out of it and you think about this rather unconventional framework, let's look at it in the context of what I call blind spots, where lenders and service providers might not see or might not be able to see the downside of this good enough equation. And radar, where lenders and service providers need models with better intelligence to help them get to these smarter yeses that you talk about. Starting with the blind spots, I want to pick on FICO.
Okay.
That is a metric, a data point that lenders use. You say it's a blind spot, maybe for different reasons, though, that others might say it's a blind spot. Tell us why you think it's a blind spot and the implications for lenders.
So far be it for me to pick on FICO. I know it's a well-ingrained and a valuable tool. Today, as you and I are talking, the average FICO score for US consumers is 715. And when you look at that historically, it went up year over year, and it's dramatically up over a decade ago. It's either stayed the same or gone up for, I think, 10 consecutive years. And I think if you read the newspaper, you'd be hard pressed to believe that the average consumer is in better shape based on consumer price indexes and all of those things. So while you need a FICO score, we believe there's more to know. And while just last week there was wheels put in motion around the previously announced effort by the credit bureaus to remove medical debt from consumers' credit scores. And the CFPB, meanwhile, is telling people that the standard they're holding you to is that you as a lender have to assess a consumer's ability to repay. So while all this is happening, we're making it more difficult to actually assess what people have to repay. We didn't remove medical debt. We just removed the availability of the information. Meanwhile, the fastest growing finance vehicle is buy now, pay later. Well, we don't exactly know how to ingrain that in everyday credit scores and credit models. One bureau said they wouldn't put that data in their credit file if it was detrimental to the consumers. Well, how are we supposed to get to what a consumer can afford? How are we supposed to get to a place where we're putting you in the right product or giving you the right amount of credit to ensure success for both the lender and the consumer? The end game is going to be an increase in the cost of credit. We believe that by assessing a consumer's bank behavior, the health of their bank relationship, you get insights that are not only going to tell you this is potentially fraud, but you're going to get insights around the stability of the account, the payment performance, and how this consumer lives within their own financial means.
The flip side of blind spots is radar, as I mentioned, and you touched on this, where you have more intelligence about the financial health of that consumer's bank account. And while it can stop bad decisions, it can also help get to smarter yeses. Give us some idea and understanding of how that works.
So recently we worked with a company that provides, it's PDI, Gas Buddy. They provide services to convenience stores where they're marrying pay-by-bank capabilities into the loyalty cards with these convenience stores. And by doing that, they leverage our services to be able to approve more consumers because we were able to quantify the consumer bank relationship, assign risk to that, and ultimately give them a higher success rate in enrolling consumers in these programs. Ultimately, if I am a grocery store or a convenience store, or anybody who's providing a loyalty program, I want to say yes to these consumers. I want to say it smartly, but the more often I can say yes, the more I get to the end game, which is the connection between my brand and the consumer.
And so you touched on the pay-by-bank use case. Do you think that in your world, you see an opportunity being unlocked with better ACH account validation to give some tailwind to the pay-by-bank examples that I think everyone is trying to, the use cases that everyone is trying to develop in order to make that a reality?
I absolutely do. If you look at ACH payments, generally speaking, they have increased in both transaction numbers and transaction amounts every year for the past 5 years across every meaningful category, be it healthcare, person-to-person payments, bill payments.
Bill pay, yeah.
ACH is here and it's here to stay, and there's benefits to service providers that they want to realize. And offering increased optionality to consumers is never a bad thing. The key to that arrangement, though, is if I'm going to take your pay-by-bank instructions, which is your bank account and routing number, it's critical to confirm that that account, in fact, belongs to the consumer who's making the application or making the payment in this case. So I think as real-time ACH and FedNow and these things become more and more adopted, the opportunity for pay by bank is only going to increase.
John, take us under the hood. I want to get an understanding of sort of your secret sauce. I mean, clearly you're not going to tell us everything, but there's obviously some things that you've done over the years, you've investments that you've made that add this level of depth and richness to the models that get to these smarter yeses that you've talked about. Give us that insight.
So any of our clients is going to the effort of quantifying the consumer bank relationship for the purpose of knowing more about that consumer and doing it in a way, I think ideally, if everyone had access to credentialed bank data, they would take it. But consumers by and large are declining that, especially at an onboarding phase. So what we have done is we have really leaned into the fact that we think coverage wins. If you're going to go to the effort, you want as much information as you can get. In October, we announced a collaboration we have with JP Morgan Chase, where we are accessing their data and by extension, early warning services data that we combine with ValidiFI's data. And ValidiFI has 1.1 billion inquiries from consumers. And then we have clients who report back to us the outcomes of those payments. So continually, we're building and able to offer what we believe is the broadest coverage in the marketplace. Because if you're going to go to the effort, you want usable intelligence that you can apply. And we believe that we have that.
Coverage in terms of the number of consumers and bank accounts that you cover?
And coverage in terms of the fact that you ask me about a consumer and a bank account, and you provide me, which not some of our consumers simply want to comply. They provide the bank account and routing number, and we tell them that's open, valid, facilitates ACH, you're compliant. In other scenarios, they're saying, if I'm going to that level of effort, I'm going to pass you the consumer's name, their property address, their email, their phone number, and their bank account and routing number. In that case, we assess the connections of the consumer to the bank account. How many different bank accounts have we seen with that consumer? How many different consumers have we seen with that bank account? Is the phone number valid? What type of phone number is it? Who's the carrier? I'm old, so it was shocking to me when our data science people recently came and said the riskiest phone number type is a landline.
Wow.
So, riskier than prepaid.
Really?
As that is a matter of fact.
No kidding. Why is that?
It's a really, I guess, because so few people have them anymore.
Interesting.
And what we find is people who perpetrate fraud, they have a scenario where they use the same bank accounts, they use the same email addresses, or they have a high frequency of change in those metrics. So we will tell you, is that phone number valid? Is the email address valid? Is it deliverable? How many different email addresses have we seen with that consumer? If it's 4 in a 90-day period in our network, their risk profile goes up 70%.
Wow.
So we're going to help you flag things to drive your treatment strategy or make credit decisions where you may want to inject friction in the process so that you're making a decision with a consumer that you feel best about.
Help me understand the competitive landscape in the environment in which you play. Because as I said at the opening, there are a lot of different piece parts to this. And if you look at this as an elephant, depending upon what part of the elephant you touch, you have a different view of what the landscape and the ecosystem is. Help us understand how you see the ecosystem.
So it's interesting that you say that. We do not consider ourselves fraud solutions provider because fraud is so big and there's so many different derivations of fraud that we would never suggest to you that we are a fraud detection. What we do is identify places based on velocity around bank accounts where we can say this is potentially fraud or that account is invalid. Same with risk. We're going to tell you that account has had NSFs. Once you've had a series of NSFs, you have a 70% likelihood that your next payment's going to be NSF as well. So we're helping our clients steer out of it. So I view us not as a necessarily a credit space provider, nor are we a fraud provider. We're bank account and payment intelligence where we look at the consumer, the bank account's payment performance, the consumer's PII, and identify places where there are incongruencies that are going to help our clients decide, I don't want to onboard this person based on their risk profile or the high likelihood of fraud, or this is a stable consumer that I want to put at the front of the line, and potentially I will offer them additional credit facility so that I'm putting my principal in the right hands.
John, do you establish personas when you look across your data set, the personas that look at good risk, bad risk, that help you understand and provide that intelligence back to your clients, whether they're banks or service providers, so that they have a better understanding of the kind of persona that's a good risk and a bad risk?
Absolutely. So we generate quarterly infographics around fraud and around the bank account intelligence, where we are sharing the insights that we see with our clients that are the hallmarks of stable account holders as compared to those who are of high risk, so that our clients can identify what is the right threshold for the amount of returns change. And I'll give you an example of that. Fatal returns is a term that we utilize a lot internally, and there are three.
It sounds bad, John. Sounds like
I think it is, and it's where you, as the person who has received this payment, has no recourse, and a lot of times it runs in concert with consumers proactively putting stop payments in place around certain scenarios, and oftentimes it's habitual. It's the same consumer entering into an agreement. Everything looks clean. The bank account is stable, but then they issue stop payments or other fatal returns against it, and you have nowhere to go.
Okay, John. So we've talked about all the ways to get to a smarter yes. Now I'm going to ask you to prove it. Can you give me some examples or an example of how you've helped one of your banks or service providers get to smarter yeses?
Sure. So we have a lending client who was frustrated with the process of asking their clients to log into their bank accounts. And they were struggling with the scenario where they were having consumers drop out of the process. So they came to us with a list of applicants, and what we were able to tell them was, here is the level to which we can tie those consumers to those accounts. And we were able to identify financial institutions where they had a low likelihood of facilitating ACH, accounts that were valid and invalid. We were able to tie the consumer's name to the account through past transactions, which enabled them to no longer have to ask for consumers to log into their bank accounts, with the exception of, we need more information. So they were driving it on people that they were totally on the fence for. But we increased their acceptance and increased their throughput and their conversion rate of consumers ultimately adopting loans, because they weren't asking them to go to further steps and getting to a level of friction that the consumers weren't comfortable with.
Interesting. So putting friction into the process when additional information is needed, but that was probably, a small percentage of those who are in the funnel.
Right. We call it managed friction. Friction's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's up to you as a service provider to marry that injection of friction based on the risk profile that the consumer comes, and you increase the number of people who are interested in your product simply by putting the friction in the right place. And our belief is we can give you information on that consumer simply through your collection of data without asking them to do anything.
Final question. I'm curious to get your thinking on the typical questions that you're always asked in a sales environment? I mean, some of the questions are probably the ones that we've already chatted about, but I'm sure that you're asked a bunch of different things that always come up. But what are some of the things that never come up that you wish would come up in terms of questions? And thinking about those questions, how would you answer them if in fact those questions you wish would come up in the conversations, in fact, would be tabled at those conversations or in those meetings?
So we typically are demonstrating off the back of our data a lot of places where people have opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
I find that a lot of our clients are not our clients necessarily, lenders, service providers are checking IDV, or they have old processes where they do IDV and then they do maybe validity, and they're running them at engagement so that they're using that to filter out applications to drive treatment strategies. I wish people would ask us, what if I wanted to engage with a consumer, get the information about their connection to the bank account, and what if I wanted to then have further opportunities to quantify that consumer by offering them the ability to log into their bank account, to do a real-time micro deposit, to do different things so that they would look at that process as being a step-up authentication versus a moment in time, I'm going to make a yes, no decision, because I think there are more opportunities. And there was a study done, it was a Harris Interactive, I believe, did it, and said that 71% of consumers have demonstrated a willingness to share information in exchange for what they call a fairer credit experience. And
Sure.
I think we have the ability to help our clients facilitate that without it becoming a labor-intensive thing, but just by offering the opportunity to continue through a process.
That's interesting, because you're right. If it creates a better opportunity to get to a yes, consumers would of course comply, but that often comes with a lot of work. But
It
you're
does.
saying that with what you guys are offering, it doesn't require a lot of work. It just
It
requires
doesn't have to
information.
be that way.
Yep.
So we could automate that process. We can leverage trusted data points for existing clients. We could automate the process of walking them through that and give the consumer control over whether or not they want to go through additional steps in exchange for the ability to get to a credit decision.
That's interesting, because consumers are engaged and they want the answer to be yes. So the
Right.
ability to get to these smarter yeses, which is how we started the conversation, is a great strategy. So I kind of lied. It's not the final question, but here's the final question, because I know you're up
Right.
for it. This is sort of random. So let's say that we at Payments, without the vowels, we're putting together a Payments with the vowels yearbook.
Okay.
And we called it the class of 2025. ValidiFI has a little logo in this yearbook called the class of 2025. I'm curious to get your thoughts on what is the little description under the entry, and how would you as the CEO sign the yearbook?
Better credit experience through data.
Love it. Now there's another great tagline. That's a t-shirt.
I'm just going to start making them now. Maybe it's my side hustle.
Could be your side hustle. I'll buy one. John, thanks so much for such a great and insightful conversation. I enjoyed it. Thanks again.
Pleasure was mine. Thanks for your time.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.